for tonight's program. My name is Elizabeth Rudrud, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And we are glad to have you for tonight's presentation. Words Writers Southwest Stories is a free monthly speaker series that highlights local authors, historians, and voices to foster a deeper understanding of our community and its people. This program, like many of our programs, are supported generously through our funders, including For Culture, the Office of Arts and Culture, Humanities Washington, and through sponsors and donors and members and program donors like you. If you'd like to learn more about the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and upcoming programs, you can visit us at loghousemuseum.org. Tonight, we will leave time for your questions for our presenter, and we ask that you submit those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those questions at the end of tonight's program. And with that, I'll pass it on to Dora Fay, who is the chair of Words Writers Southwest Stories.
Hello, everybody. I want to introduce Hanna Brooks Olsen to you. She is a writer from Oregon. Her essays and reporting have appeared in The Nation, The Atlantic, The New York Daily News, the BBC, Bust Magazine, Pacific Standard, Ms. Magazine, and elsewhere. She's a regular contributor to Real Change in Seattle and is currently working on her second novel. She has worked as a senior communications and social media manager, acknowledging she's had a lot of jobs, which means she brings a especially unique voice and experience to her work. Some of those jobs included, but are not limited to, digital media manager, marketing specialist, senior copywriter, journalist, editor-in-chief, freelance political consultant, speechwriter, policy analyst, morning zoo radio personality, public radio producer, concessions purveyor, and janitor. She also worked for 1 week at a Bath and Body Works in college, but when they made her say happy holidays, she found other employment. When she's not stringing words together, she enjoys listening to audiobooks, the Seattle Mariners, making impulse purchases at secondhand stores, running, walking around North Portland with her dog Lola, who really loves to go to bars. Hannah's book, Notoriously Bad Character, The True Story of Lou Graham and the Immigrants and Sex Workers Who Built Seattle, is the first to explore the often misrepresented life of Seattle's most infamous madam. Thank you, Hannah. It's all yours.
Okay, you can hear me? We're good? Great.
We can hear you.
Perfect. Good. All right. So let's see what we've got. Who's this? Hi, I'm Hannah. I wrote this book, and the path to getting this book into publication is about as long as my intro, so long. I was initially contacted by University of Washington Press to pitch them a book, and as happens with a lot of writers, I pitched them something else. They didn't want it. And then I pulled an idea out of the air while I was still there pitching. And I said, what about Lou Graham? Because if you've been in Seattle a little while, and you might remember there was a website for a while called Seattle-ish. It was like a Tumblr news blog. That was me and a couple of my friends. And we were very passionate about not just Pacific Northwest history, but sort of uncovering Pacific Northwest history, in addition to sort of like regular City Hall reporting, gossip. And at one point, Seattle was trying to name a park. And we did sort of a little bit of number crunching, and we found that Seattle had precisely one park named after a woman, just one at the time. And so we created a pitch for why Lou Graham should have a park named after her. They obviously didn't choose that. That's fine. But in that time, I had done a bunch of research into Lou Graham. And so why her? Why this book? Because initially University of Washington Press said yes to it when I pulled that idea out of nowhere. So that is why. But also because the more I've looked into her story, the more research I've done. I've been working on this for 8 years now in total. I've been to many archives. I've had many conversations. And I found that her story specifically is very, very important, not just for Seattle and not just for like United States history in general, but for this moment. Because Lou Graham, as an immigrant, I think represents not just the sort of early days of Seattle, colonization, whiteness as sort of a construct, but also the stories that we tell ourselves about our own histories. Right now, especially with immigration, with ICE, where I am here in Portland, uh, people have a lot of stories about how their family came to the United States. A lot of people are very proud that their family came here legally. And in looking into Lou Graham's story, one of the things I realized was we don't have a really great understanding of what immigration looked like 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And as a result, we tell ourselves these false stories about what it means to be an immigrant, how people came here. And I think it's really important to sort of unpack that. So that's one of the reasons that I think Lou Graham is really important right now. So who was she? You probably know about her because of the Underground Tour. Like most people heard about Lou Graham in the Underground Tour. If you have taken Bill Speidel's Underground Tour, you know there's a very large picture of her on the wall, and she factors in really heavily. Unfortunately, almost everything you learned on that tour is maybe not 100% true. So, but we'll get into that. Lou Graham was born in February of 1862 in Germany. She came to America when had just turned 16. She came with a family friend, most likely an aunt. We're not 1,000% sure. And then where she was between that time and when she actually got to Seattle, there's about a decade. And we don't really know what happened in that time. So that's just a part of it. And that is because she adopted this name. And again, in keeping with the histories we tell ourselves and how we sort of tend to associate modern day constructs with the past, there weren't great tracking mechanisms. There weren't great ways for keeping track of where people were and how they moved. It was very easy to change your name, pay for everything in cash, and just sort of go. So there's about 10 years where we don't know where Lou Graham was. Now, nope. All right. So, nope, that's also not right. Here we go. Again, on immigration. Okay. So Lou Graham moved to, when she came to Seattle, she was still not a naturalized American citizen. She was still technically a citizen of Germany. Now, under the Constitution, as you'll see, this is a little piece that was in the newspaper at the time. Immigrants were not technically legally allowed to own property in Washington state. That didn't stop her. She still bought property. She bought many properties. But at the time that she died, you can see here, she had like $86,000 worth of just property. She had about 24 properties up and down Washington state, along where the railroad was probably going to go. She was pretty significantly interested in speculation, in addition to being this brothel owner that we all know her as. Now, she owned all this property illegally because she never finished naturalizing. And that is why when she died in 1903, there was a 4-year long land grab and state Supreme Court case, which ultimately ended up establishing case law about the ability for immigrants to own property. So, in addition to Lou Graham being this incredible brothel owner that we've all heard about from the Underground Tour, she also is really important to Washington state law and immigration law. So, I think that's pretty interesting. Also deserves to note that at the time when Lou Graham got to Seattle, which is around 1882, probably. We're not like 1,000% sure when she actually got into Seattle because she was probably using a fake name when she got there. There were still extremely draconian rules about how Indigenous people could come and go from Seattle. And we have to take a moment to talk about the fact that when the Denny Party showed up in Seattle, 40 years before Lou got there, they showed up to a place that was very much already populated. It was not an empty wasteland. It was not nothing. There were people there with centuries of history that the white people who came exercised their assumed God-given dominion over, and almost immediately began legislating that Indigenous people were not only not permitted to like do business, they literally were not even allowed to be in the city of Seattle. So the way that white people colonized Seattle was very abrupt, and it happened sort of all at once. So by the time Lou Graham gets here, Indigenous people are not allowed in bars for sure, and they are not allowed really in the downtown area. that did not stop Lou Graham from employing and working with Indigenous people, which I think also speaks to her character, and we'll get to that some more too. Now, Lou Graham showed up in Seattle with enough cash to buy at least one property. We first hear about her being in Seattle when she buys a piece of property, which ultimately, now, if you picture where the railroad tunnel goes into downtown, right about like Fifth Avenue, like kind of where Fifth and Yesler goes like this, her first property was basically where that tunnel is now, and she sold it to the railroads for like a considerable amount of money. But that's the property she bought first. It's the first time we see, for sure, Lou Graham in Seattle. She's buying a piece of property and it says to a man named Lou Graham in the newspaper, which I think is very funny. She begins to build her business, and then the Seattle fire happens. And this is also really where Lou's fortune turns, because Seattle before and after the fire are two very different places. Before the fire, you can see here, so these pictures behind me, these pictures are from a pretty large group of images that came from University of Washington, and it's this guy Thomas Proch's like sort of his memory book of a lot of things. But this is an actual picture of, that's Henry Yesler in the hat, or sorry, that's Jacob Firth in the hat. So Jacob Firth was a banker, and he, in a lot of ways, was the person who Lou worked as a silent partner with. So he was also he was from Bohemia, so he's basically Germany. He's basically German. He was of Jewish descent, but he himself was not practicing, and he was generally known as like a very good dude around town. And she supplied him with a lot of liquid capital after the fire, and that is how Seattle rebuilt after 1889. You can also see here behind me, I'm dyslexic, so this back and forth thing is kind of tough. The population of Seattle grew from 1880 to 1889 by 12-fold. So it went from 3,500 people to 42,000 people. And if you were living in Seattle, sort of about like 2012, you probably know how this feels, because at the time between 2012 and 2014 in Seattle, when we were adding about 200 new residents like a week, the growth felt huge. But that pushed a lot of things in Seattle where it had sort of still been sort of this little fishing village. The buildings were not really built to a high degree of safety code. There was no municipal water. So when the fire sweeps through, it's Seattle's opportunity to really start over. And that's when we get the underground. And that's when we get, a lot of the buildings that we have today, including the building that Lou Graham ran her brothel out of, which is now the Union Gospel Mission. Another huge part of the story that we really have to get to is the role of Klondikers. There is no Lou Graham story without Klondikers, because there is no Seattle without Klondikers. At this time, the way that Seattle was bringing in money was gambling, saloons, and prostitution, sex work. Those were some of the main revenues. The hundreds of men who just poured in, coming and going from Skagway, were super important at this time. They were doing a lot of business. They were buying and selling goods, and they were just spending that money that they had. And so this is also what sets the stage for Lou Graham to run her brothel. You may have heard reports that her brothel was like the nicest one in town. This is true. She was very fancy. And unlike other places where you might have gone and gotten robbed, defenestrated, at Lou Graham's place, that was not going to happen. She was very above board. Her girls were, of a higher caliber. The bedding was nice. She had so much stuff, like nice things, that it just felt like a more upscale place, as opposed to, say, the Paris Hotel or the Aurora or any of the other bordellos that were open at the time. So, final point of, I think, important history in all of this is that at the same time that Lou Graham is having her ascension as a brothel boss, she's owned multiple properties. She's operating after the fire. At the same time, Washington is going back and forth on suffrage. So while Lou is getting more and more money, she's making political friends. She is essentially bankrolling the development of the city, because it's good for her and it's good for business, right? At the same time, there's a very big anti-saloon movement happening, and women's suffrage is happening in Washington. Women got the vote in Washington 10 years before the rest of the country. It does deserve note that Indigenous people did not get the right to vote signed into law until 1924. But At the time when women were given the vote in Washington, that was all women. It was by basis of sex. So if other people of color had the vote, the women did as well. Obviously, there was a lot of additional back and forth on that. But part of women getting the vote was trying to cut back on the sale of alcohol. This becomes important for Lou Graham because she not only ran a brothel, she ran a bar. And the way that the city would often sort of extract money out of brothel owners was by citing them for selling liquor either in a place where women worked, which women were not technically legally allowed to work in a bar, or selling liquor without a license. Whether they had one or not kind of didn't really matter. So at the same time that Lou Graham is doing business from her brothel, that she is in close with a lot of politicians, there is also this growing sentiment to get the graft and to get the vice out of Seattle. This is tough though, because again, the Seattle budget doesn't exist without that vice. And every time a new mayor came in, which was about every 2 years for a period of like 15 years, they would come in with promises to clean up the city budget and to run things without vice and without graft. They would quickly realize that was impossible. And one of the mayors who did it was J.T. Ronald. He later went on to become a judge, and his home is still a historical home in Leschi in Seattle. That house was functionally paid for by Lou Graham's legal fees, but that's another story. He came in to try to run the city without the influence of vice and found it was nearly impossible, almost bankrupted the city, only lasted 2 years in the mayor's office and said it was the worst 2 years of his life. So I think one of the things that most people really care the most about with Lou Graham is like what is true and what isn't true. She is absolutely the stuff of tall tales. And if you look on TikTok, if you look on Twitter, if you look anywhere and you look for things about Lou Graham, you will hear these things, you will see this picture, right? I have it on good authority that this is not a photograph of Lou Graham, and I can say this pretty confidently based on the dress, the hairstyles, this sort of like big short bouffant is like not really of the time. The reason that we think or people think that this photo is of Lou Graham is because in the 1970s, I think, I had a very long lunch with Paul Dorpat, and he told me a lot of this stuff, and then I looked more into it. A box of glass slides was found in an estate. And the person who found it went around to some of the old timers in Seattle who had been around and said, "Who do you think this is?" And a number of them said they thought it might have been Lou Graham. This was not confirmed, and it remains unconfirmed. But from this picture, there were a million myths, right? That you could say a special keyword and request the woman in black, that, like every myth you have about this picture is probably not true. So regret to inform, but that is the thing. We have also seen a great retelling of Lou Graham's history. And this starts with Bill Spidell. Bill Spidell originated the underground. And the thing about Bill Spidell is this. We owe him an immense debt of gratitude. His work as a preservationist on Pioneer Square really turned the entire neighborhood, like it kept the neighborhood from being turned into, a concrete brutalist nightmare. Like so many other downtowns of other cities that were renovated in the 60s, like that happened to them, right? We still have all those gorgeous brownstones in Pioneer Square because of Bill Spidell, and I think that's very important. However, his books, like Sons of the Prophets, which is recommended in any list of what should I read if I want to know more about Seattle history, his stories are gathered from sort of oral histories, often involving people he met in bars. They are unsighted. And then he was also just sort of more interested in the mythology of it all. So a lot of the things that you think you know about Lou Graham came from Bill Spidell. And in fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page, like I can always tell whenever someone's making a video about Lou Graham, and I can tell they've just read the Wikipedia page because it's the same factoids. But if you go to the Wikipedia page for Lou Graham, go down to the sources, it's all Bill Spidell. So these are just things that he said that weren't necessarily backed up. One of them is that she died of syphilis, which is 1,000% not true, and I will show you the proof of that in a moment. The fact that she was the biggest funder of King County schools, that is also not true. Because as I mentioned, when she died, she was not legally allowed to own all that property, and she had a ton of other stuff. So they had to decide what to do with it. She didn't leave a will when she died. So then there was this big to do of finding her relatives back in Germany. She didn't have any natural children, like she didn't have any children of her own, and she was unmarried. So they really didn't know what to do. So King County and her estate guy, who was a banker, he was a disciple of Jacob Firth, they worked together for years to unpack her ownings and her life. And this is how we know almost everything that we actually know about Lou Graham is from her estate. So her estate information is so interesting. Now, I can take some questions. I also have some further reading. These are some other books that I read and found. And I actually have some other photos which I might be able to dig up, but I don't want to get into them right now. So that is a brief overview of some of the research, some of the stuff. But I would love to know what questions you have because I do feel like there's sort of a lot of I'm always surprised by the questions people have. So I would love to know what you're thinking about and if you have any questions, and if not, I can also just keep talking.
I see no questions typed in here yet.
All
And
right. Well,
so
in
go
that
ahead.
all right. Well, in that case, let me see if I can find some of these other pictures really quickly. You're still going to see my screen, but let me find these other ones. Let's see here. Come on now. Nope. Oh, that's me. I also have a podcast about cleaning if that's something you're interested in. It's called Spotless. Can't say I hugely recommend it. I mean, I do. I think it's quite good. It's mine, obviously, but okay. I cannot find this right now, so I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a minute. So a couple of other things about Lou Graham until we get some questions. So, as I mentioned, one of the ways that I know how she died and what happened in her last days, uh, the receipt from the doctor that she went to is in her estate filings. So at King County Archives, you can go and get a massive portfolio of all of the paperwork that went into figuring out Lou Graham's estate. And it has lists and lists of properties. It has lists of her jewelry, and she had so much jewelry. And part of that was a way to flaunt her wealth, but part of it was also a way to pay people and potentially bribe politicians. Because if you think about I always think about, I think it's Goodfellas maybe, when the husband asks how much money the wife needs to go shopping and she goes like this. Like instead of handing someone a wad of bills, she could give someone a watch or a necklace or a pair of cufflinks that were very expensive but took up less space. So she had on her at all times tons of necklaces. She had my all-time favorite detail is that she had a diamond encrusted mini dagger that she used as a hat pin, but also for self-defense because people did try to rob her on several occasions. But the other thing we know about her is that she was such a known entity. She was kind of like a celebrity at the time. The newspapers talked about her very breathlessly. Uh, and so I think it's interesting to read through the newspaper accounts about her, compare them to the things she actually owned. You can see lists of things she owned. Um, but I think it's really interesting to go into the things we actually know about her. And again, so with the syphilis thing, we can see literally every single thing that the doctor did in the 2 days that she took to die, basically. Her stomach ruptured. That's what happened. It was not syphilis, which would have been a very long and painful death. She died quite young. And so we know that that wasn't it. It's really not that hard to debunk, right? We do have questions now, so let's go. Have I encountered the Trump brothel history in Seattle? No. That has never actually come up in any of the work I've been doing, but I think it's because it came up quite a bit later. I think that timeline happened several decades, like at another time. Biggest discrepancies between the facts and myths. So again, the big one is that on the underground tour and on the plaque on her building, to be fair, this is on the plaque on her building, which it is my life's goal to get a new plaque on her building. It says that she was the single biggest donor to King County schools. That is not true. She did not donate that money. She did not donate that land. However, Highline Public Schools municipal building is down in Des Moines, Washington. That was one of her properties, and it was a piece of property that King County got after she died. She did not donate it, though. So that's like a big one, which isn't to say she wasn't super generous. As a side note, there are at least 3 noted occasions where she offered to pay the legal fees of a young woman who was on trial for killing her abusive husband. 3 different times, Lou Graham writes to women in this situation and says, honey, I want to cover your legal bills. What that tells us about Lou Graham, I think, is open for interpretation. She was quite generous in a lot of ways, but that idea that she just donated to King County Public Schools is not true. I think the other biggest discrepancy is this idea that she was sort of like a queer icon. I think she probably was queer. She was never married, and she did achieve something kind of incredible in that she became wealthy of her own volition, not through a husband and not through a dad, right? Like that's really rare. So she did do that. And I think that's quite notable. But the fact that she never married, never had kids, again, read into that what you will. Um, I think that the rumor about her donating to schools, I think that comes from a misreading of the court case, basically, or sort of a misattribution. It's also possible that that was a rumor that was going around at the, sort of several years later or several decades later, but not necessarily. One question is, why did she leave Germany? Germany in 1860 was rough, especially where she lived. She lived outside of Hamburg in a place called Lübeck. I think there just weren't a lot of opportunities for young women there. It was a time when there was massive, massive immigration to the United States and to Seattle specifically. One of the reasons that like Ballard is the little Nordic island that it is because of this migration pattern of folks coming from Scandinavian countries, from England, from Germany. They would come and then they would sort of make their way across as the rail did. So I have a belief about what I think happened and why she picked Seattle, but I really think it had to do with the opportunity of it. At the time, there just weren't a lot of women. Like, do you guys know about the Mercer girls? Are we familiar with the Mercer girls story? Asa Mercer of Mercer Street noted that there were just not a lot of single gals. There was a lot of men there because there were Klondikers, fur trappers, businessmen. After the Civil War, a lot of folks came also out to the West Coast for land and for fresh air because the East Coast had really industrialized. And it was also kind of a miserable place, like right after the Civil War. So all these men came out, not a lot of women were there. So Asa Mercer took a boat down all the way down and around. He went to Lowell, Massachusetts, found a bunch of like Civil War, like their dads had died in the Civil War, and these young girls were, kind of just there hanging out. Cities like Lowell had been really kept in business by the Civil War effort, making uniforms, stamping buttons, whatever, making ammunition. After that happened, a lot of those towns were kind of economically depressed. So Asa Mercer went and was like, ladies, do you want a husband? And some 2 dozen girls were like, okay. So they paid him, fun fact, came back down and around. And then for many years, the city of Seattle was sort of captivated with the idea of these Mercer girls, these girls who came, they were like teenagers and young women. Some of them became teachers, several of them got married. And so I think Lou Graham also chose Seattle because of that opportunity, because there was a real need for, we should say, not just women, there was a desire for white women. Indigenous women at this time were fetishized, sexualized, and commodified by white men. Henry Esler had an illegitimate child with an indigenous woman while his white wife was still back on the East Coast. When his white wife came back, he kicked his love child and his girlfriend out of the house. That was like that's not known, right? So the attitude towards indigenous women at the time was also extremely, extremely toxic. And so there was this like hunt to this pursuit to bring more white women over. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Lou picked Seattle as well. And especially then once the Klondike picked up, I think that was a huge part of it. I cannot name any of Lou's famous customers is the question because they did not keep records like that. This is one of the biggest challenges, but one of the reasons that this kind of storytelling is so important, I think, because the reason that there are streets named and places named for Asa Mercer and Henry Esler and, like Doc Maynard and is because in their time, those men were deemed important enough for those records to be kept, right? We have a ton of letters from Asa Mercer, from the Denny party, because the words and thoughts of those people was considered important enough to keep and save over time. The words and ideas and lived experience of marginalized people, not so much. So we just don't have a lot of that information. We can find out who Lou Graham employed really kind of only through arrest records, because every now and then the police would come shake down the brothel basically to make extra money for the city. And so we would see them. But in the arrest records, if you look at the, like, they're in Seattle City Hall. I was there the day before COVID shut down, actually, like gathering information, and I got kicked out of City Hall because they were like, "Oh, we're actually shutting this down now. There is a pandemic." And I was like, "Okay." Uh, those books have the arrest records, and even those women, her employees, are listed by just their first name. It'll just be like Lila, Bella. Sometimes they have a little like nickname almost. There's at least one woman named French Camille who worked for her. That name came up several times. Um, but we know from the arrest records that some of the women she employed were women of color because their race is listed on the arrest record. So that's kind of interesting. Um, there's also a question, were there children she fostered or looked after? Yes. So she did not legally foster anybody. But again, in like 1889, 1890, the social safety net in Seattle was, if you can believe it, even worse than it is now. And when, say, a guy would be left by his wife and maybe she left the kids behind, there weren't great options for like what to do with those kids. And bordellos were kind of always open. So on numerous occasions, we see that usually single men leave their children at the bordello. So there were multiple occasions when children were just there chilling. Several years later, Seattle would hire its first ever police matron. So this is something that was in the budget, and I actually have a sneaking suspicion that Lou Graham was part of the reason that this actually happened, because I think she was like, "Hey, like police could be handling this instead of me," uh, and the police matron's job was basically to take care of like women and orphans. Um, and they hired a woman named Emma Taylor. She is fascinating in her own right. Her late husband was a merchant marine. She had two adult children of her own. And by the time she got this job, she was just sort of a, middle-aged lady. She she writes a story, she writes a letter to the chief of police that her first day on the job, she like walks into the jail and sees that it is a mess. It is people mixing around, drinking, playing cards, hooking up in the jail. And she was like, this has got to stop. So she, sort of separates people out, creates some new protocols. And one of the things that she started doing was then also taking in children. So after we get the police matron, we no longer see this from Lou, except for the one child who was believed to be her heiress for a long time and then turned out was not related to her. So Lou Graham had a best friend named Nellie Delma. She worked for Lou and she had a child. I cannot find who this child's father is anywhere, in part because Nellie's name is probably also fake. But what we do know is that she had a child named Ulna, like the bone in your arm, and that child lived with Lou Graham and Nellie. Now, Lou Graham had two primary pieces of property in the city of Seattle. One is the building on Washington, 2nd and Washington. The other was up on Madison, kind of by where the Trader Joe's is, at like 21st and Madison. That was her house where she lived, and it was sort of viewed as like a resort. It was like where she would sometimes bring girls from the brothel when they just like needed some time off. She'd bring them up to the fancy house and they could just like hang out and get cared for and get pampered and read. That's where Ulna and Lou's best friend Nellie lived. In Lou's estate records, when we look through all of that's Louisville. When we look through all of her belongings in both the brothel and in her home on Madison, there's at least one children's bedroom and a ton of things that belonged to children. So she did actually have a child basically with her friend. Her friend Nellie was with her when she went to San Francisco in 1903 and then subsequently died. And it was Nellie who brought Lou's body back up on a train and dealt with all the funeral arrangements and then got her buried. The reason Lou was even out of town, it occurs to me I didn't actually say this. In 1903, that undercurrent of religiosity and anti saloon madness kind of came to a head because so John Considine was a vaudeville guy, sort of a big personality. He's got like a moon face. He and Lou were peers, and he was best friends with a guy named William Meredith. William Meredith was John Considine's like little buddy, and he used to do security for his club and some other stuff. So they were tight. And then William Meredith gets promoted to be a cop, and then William Meredith gets promoted to be chief of police. And then he and Considine have a falling out. He basically tries to tell Considine to clean up his act. Considine says, I don't think so. And he turns on William Meredith, goes to the city like council and the aldermen and says, hey, you know your man Meredith is dirty. And William Meredith gets fired. He then is so mad at his former friend John Considine for betraying him that he tracks him down at a drugstore that is, if you can picture where Smith Tower is, right? Kitty corner from that. You know how there's that building that's always been boarded up like forever? That used to be a drugstore, like, and the kind where they would hang out, like a soda fountain type place. William Meredith shows up, probably fairly intoxicated, and like cocks a shotgun at John Considine. John Considine somehow gets a shot off first and kills William Meredith. This sets into like a chain of events where a lot of now very anti-saloon and very closed city, which is like shutting down the brothels, shutting down the gambling, elected officials move up in the world. And that includes the new mayor and the new chief of police. So they decide that they are going to fully shut down all of the brothels. Prior to this, for many years, the brothels had been able to operate as long as they were kind of sufficiently away from the rest of town. If you've seen The Wire, it was literally Amsterdam. And the line that they drew out in the city where it's like, okay, gambling and prostitution can happen below this line was called the Deadline. There is now a bar in Pioneer Square called the Deadline, and it is named for this. And when they first drew up the Deadline, they drew like a little dog leg around Lou's place. Like she was sort of carved out so that she was still allowed to operate. Once William Meredith is killed, there's a new sheriff in town. They decide that's not going to happen. So she is deciding what to do next. She closes down her brothel for a little while and decides to get out of town to get out of the heat. So she and Nellie go to San Francisco. I'm reasonably sure that Lou Graham had properties in San Francisco. I think she was trying to decide whether or not to move her whole operation down there because it was more permissive at that time. But within just like a couple of days of getting there, she gets sick and she has this awful stomach pain, and she has either an ulcer or a perforated bowel. The doctor comes several times. She gets brought to the German hospital in San Francisco, and she ultimately dies without the will. And that is what sets into motion all of this other stuff. So like, but a lot of these things we only really know because of the estate records, because of newspapers, and because of like paperwork that was left over. But there's all these other things that we don't know. Another question is, say a few words about Mother Damnable and John Pinnell. Yeah, so Mother Damnable is sort of like the first Seattle brothel owner. John Pinnell owned the Elahi, which was a bordello, basically, staffed almost entirely by Indigenous women. But that was sufficiently earlier than Lou Graham. So they came along like 20 years, a decade before Lou was up and running. There are a lot of other brothel owners that we see in the same time as Lou. Ray McRoberts is a big one. Her real name is Cora Whipple. When she dies, there's like some stories about her, but pretty much everybody else's places were not really viewed as like as nice or as interesting as Lou's. Lou's was very much viewed as like a spectacle, and people would talk about what she wore and where she was and what she was up to. And she was sort of viewed by finer society as this kind of lovable pain in the ass because they knew she was up to stuff. But again, a lot of money came in through these operations. There's a house on Beach Drive in West Seattle that is reportedly a vacation house for sex workers. I don't think that was connected to Lou. I never found her owning any property in West Seattle. Again, she owned a lot of property. She owned at least 2 places in Bellingham, including one in Fairhaven, which is still there. She owned a place in Tacoma, which I've actually never been able to locate. She owned a place like way up at the border. She owned several properties in Ballard. She might have operated a little brothel up in Ballard, but I've never really been able to connect those dots because, again, a lot of this wasn't getting written down. And we don't have any of her belongings because she didn't have any relatives. Or the relatives she did had were back in Germany. And I don't know if you know this, but between 1903 and now, several things have happened in Germany that have made it so that documentation was lost, including but not limited to her, one of her like longest living relatives who died in a firebombing, and it was of her apartment, and it probably took a lot of the Lou documentation with it. So that is rough. Let's see. Who else are some of our questions? I think, oh, what is Lou's biggest impact? So I think one of Lou's biggest impacts, I mean, a couple of things. One, right after the fire, Seattle got municipal water. That was the real, like, sort of brainchild of Harry White, who was the mayor right after the guy who was the mayor at the time of the fire in 1989. There's a decent amount of evidence that that municipal water, which comes down from like way at the hill, was at least partially funded by Lou Graham. She was a silent benefactor of a lot of buildings. There's a lot of buildings in Seattle that she probably paid for, or her workforce paid for. And then the case law around whether or not immigrants can own property, that decision in 1907 did really influence a lot of reassessment of what it meant to buy and sell property and for someone to be an immigrant. Because again, whiteness is conditional. How old was Lou Graham when she died? Great question. So she died in 1903. We are pretty sure that she was born in 62? She was in her middle to late 30s, maybe early 40s. She was quite young when she died, which makes sense as to why then people would assume it must have been a sexually transmitted infection because of her line of work. But it's not that. The more likely culprit is the sheer volume of rot gut liquor that she and everybody else were drinking at the time. So in her estate records, they list out room by room her belongings because after she died, people came out of the woodwork to try and like get her stuff. And so they itemized everything she owned. One of my favorite details is that in the wine room of her brothel, there was only like 4 wine glasses, but there was a bunch of whiskey glasses. So I thought that was kind of a funny little quirk of hers. It's very likely she was consuming quite an amount of liquor, and that probably had to do with her exploding guts that basically happened. And by the time she could see a doctor, it was kind of too late. But yeah, she did die quite young. Are there Audible books on brothels and maps? No. So this is. I was initially contacted by University of Washington Press to write this book. I wrote this book with them over the course of about 3 years. We were in the final publication or like the final draft stages when UW sent my book to get read by several like anonymous readers, local experts who decided that they didn't really want to put out a book on sex work, and that because of all of this research, which hasn't necessarily been dug into, it might be like too upending. So they canceled my contract, which is why I ended up self-publishing it. You can buy it now on Amazon. You can buy it on my website. But I had to self-publish it because I had a finished book just chilling for several years, and because people kept asking me about it. I wrote a story for Seattle Magazine about it. I also did a radio piece on KNKX about it, just because people keep, in the vacuum of other historical research, people will just come up with stuff. And this is why they keep peddling these untrue stories about Lou Graham. This is why there are so many myths about her, is because there just isn't that much scholarship around Seattle history beyond, I don't think Bill Spidell ever intended for his books to become the be all end all of Seattle history, and yet they did. Like, people just sort of have taken those for granted. Now, I highly recommend this book, which is Skid Road by Murray Morgan. This one's quite good. There's also a book about Chief Seattle that's very good. I have a list of other books that I have found really instructive and helpful. Also, if you are interested in fiction at the time, so at one point in my research, I was just like buying weird old out of print books just to see if they had any additional information for me. One of the ones I found, this is a book that is out of print. It is called Annie Jordan by Mary Brinker Post. And this is a novel written about like 1895-ish Seattle. And it was written by a woman whose father was a judge. She wrote the book in like 1945, so she was coming about a generation after, but her father and grandfather both were civil servants. And so she got a lot of stories from them and turned them into this novel. So, like, this novel that I found, long out of print from 1945, is one of the best examples that I've been able to find of writing about women at this time, because there just isn't a lot of it. Um, I think there's a ton more work to be done. I think there's a million more stories. One of my favorite facts about this time period, if you've ever been to Pioneer Square in Seattle and you've been to the waterfall park, you might know there's a plaque on it and it says that this is where UPS was started. If you've ever wondered about that, what was on that property before was a saloon with a brothel above it. And two guys, William Casey, whose family now, like many generations later, runs the Annie Casey Foundation, and someone else whose name I forget at this moment, they started basically a messenger service in the basement of that brothel, and it became UPS. So, like, that's a connection to the story. That's really wild. I'm surprised no one has told that story before. The only reason I know this is because I looked at old plat records and I looked at old property ownership records and I like triangulated. Um, but there's kind of just not, I don't know if there just isn't an appetite for it. That I was told when I was shopping the book around that people just didn't care, that there's not enough of a market for it. I think that's untrue. But Seattle is unlike cities that you would kind of think of as peers. San Francisco, there's a lot of scholarship in San Francisco around women and marginalized people, you know, at the turn of the century. It's just not the case in Seattle. So I don't have a lot of recommendations other than like these couple, like a fiction book that's been long out of print. But I do think it's kind of interesting. Um, do you have any other questions? Will I be writing more on this topic? I mean, I'm still constantly working on this book. Like, this book is a work in progress for me because I am falling down rabbit holes every day. I learn new stuff all the time. My hope is that at some point I'll be able to link together more, like putting together some more of the big questions, like what was Lou Graham doing between when she showed up in New York and when she got to Seattle? I don't know. And I may never know. We all may never know. But I am sort of always doing research on this subject. I'm currently working on a second novel, and that is about a kind of a interesting family story I learned about in Portland and Aberdeen, Washington. So I'm sort of fictionalizing that. But if there are any other stories that people want me to hunt down in Seattle, I would love to. Because doing this kind of research, I think, is really enjoyable. And I think it's also, I just think it's so helpful. Like, I think it's such a helpful way to contextualize ourselves, you know, especially right now. Like, we are in a new era of sex work with OnlyFans and with TikTok and like the way that people are monetizing themselves visually. I think it's worthwhile to do research on how that looked, you know, in previous generations. I also think, again, the way we view ourselves and our family histories and our understanding of immigration, I think has colored the way that now we believe things should be, and it's kind of just not that way. Will I write Emma the Matron story? Oh man, I would love to write Emma the Matron story. I do have so there are connections between Lou and Pike Place Market, not specifically Pike Place, but that street that it's on, and then where it used to be the Green Tortoise Hostel, that was a brothel. It was not owned by Lou, it was owned by one of her competitors, but it was like one of the hot spots. That area did used to really be before the deadline, before everything really got pushed. Another one that used to be a brothel is the Diller Room. Um, Here's a possible mystery for you. Was young Milton Holgate fragged by sailors? Oh my gosh. So the 1956 Battle of Seattle is a very fascinating time and one that there is starting to be more emerging scholarship on. But again, when you get that far back, it's really hard because things have just gotten lost. And unless somebody comes forward with a box of letters, it's very hard to get more information. This is, though, also the moment when I will give one of my greatest pleas, which is that we have got to be better funding archiving archivists, and we have got to be doing a better job of digitizing. There is a series of documents that in Washington State, just called Frontier Justice, that is part of the Washington State Archive. And it was put onto one computer system in the 80s or something, and then that crashed, and it's just gone now. We just don't have it. There are decades upon decades of records that have just been lost because of floods or fires. And when going to look for these things, we need people who know their way around these documents. Archivists absolutely do the Lord's work. The archivists I've gotten to work for are amazing, but there is just so much stuff that we have not provided the time and attention to go through. Like there are for sure secrets in those archives that we may never find. Um, so I think if you have an area of interest, I always encourage people to like write your local archivist and see what they can help you figure out. But there are just documents and documents that when I went to the Puget Sound Regional Archive, which is out in Kirkland, I guess technically, I got there, was greeted by the oldest human being of all time, who I'm sure has been working there since the Mayflower landed. And, they give you the little white gloves. Now, white gloves are a very controversial term, like idea in archivist circles. So don't come after me if you're anti-white glove. But they give you the little gloves. You're not allowed to take any pens in. You can take a golf pencil, and they wheel you over a cart of just the files you've asked for. But you're kind of at the mercy of what they think is within your request. And we just don't have enough humans doing the work of combing through paper documents. But when I was there and I got Lou Graham's estate records, it was a wild experience to sit with this huge accordion folder of her laundry receipts, of her, like receipts from the jeweler, and to see things that she had signed and that she had touched. Like it was such a incredible experience. But I know there are so many more out there. So I am like, I'm very, very passionate about digitizing and about funding archiving projects because I do think it's really important. We have like 5 minutes. What else do you have for me? Nobody else has questions? Let's see.
I think you have done an excellent job tonight, Hannah. You are the most expressive and free-flowing presenters that we have had. You've been very delightful to hear you and hear all those stories and how you put them together, and that your writing. And we wish you well in your second novel. Someone asked a question, I maybe missed the answer, but are your books available? I mean, is your book available?
Yes. So you
Oh,
can
you
buy.
said
Yes.
Amazon and you.
Regrettably, it is only on Amazon or on my website. You can buy a PDF on my website if you want to read it like on your Kindle. It's also available on EPUB on my website, or you can get the paper copy mailed to you on Amazon. Again, it is self-published, which is a bummer. If anybody knows of a publishing house that would like to pick it up and actually put it into publication. But there's like several of the images that I mentioned. There's a lot of the receipts. I tried to put in, oh, that's John Constantine. There he is. Oh, that dude. Love that guy. And so a lot of these stories are in there, and it's a book that I really loved. Yeah, I have so many more pictures. There's also pictures on my website. If you go to hannahbrooksolsen.com, you can like find the whole piece about the book. There's other photos. I've tried to figure out another way to make some of these pictures available, because there are just, I mean, there's so many things in the records. There's so many bits and pieces. Um, let's see. Oh, wait a minute. Can I share my screen right now? Because I do actually have some photos I could show you guys really quickly. Heck yeah. Okay, wait. I want to share a screen because I do want to show you some of these real fast. Also, to answer the question, Wallace, Idaho. I have not done any research into Wallace, Idaho. Is that a place I should look?
Yes.
There's a lot of those like little frontier towns that were sort of, you know, around the same time as Seattle that had a lot of like various similar currents. So here, can you see the screen that I'm sharing here? Let's see, let's go full screen. Okay, so I have a couple of images here. Can you see them? I believe you can. Okay, so like that's her building, and that's still there. This is like the property record of it. This is the house on Madison. That's what it looked like. It's no longer there. After she owned it and lived in it, and then it went to auction when she died, in part to pay back like all the estate stuff and also to pay off. She had some creditors she had to pay off. So this little house, which was like very sort of Germanic looking, it became a sanitarium briefly. It was kind of cursed. And then later it was purchased by a woman who was the first Black woman to work as a realtor in Seattle. And they actually turned it into a little B&B that was in the Green Book. So it was specifically for like Black travelers. It's called the Dunbar. It's a really interesting history, and then they bulldozed it. This is the property records from the one in Bellingham. This is like the list. These are all of her properties. Like this is just a bunch of properties listed out. That's how many she owned. Most of them were undeveloped, but some of them were developed. Here we go. This is 7 wine glasses, 21 whiskey glasses in the wine room. So that's fun. She also had a ton of ice. So her ice bills were huge, which I just think is so interesting because we all just think about ice as like whatever, you just get ice to put in your drink. But at the time, the ice literally had to be shipped either from like the Great Lakes or Greenland, and it would come in these big chunks. And she went through like a lot of ice. I didn't even talk about seamstresses as the biggest. Okay, the whole seamstress thing, real quick. If you ever hear someone talk about like seamstresses and that, that's like what their code. No, untrue. There was no seamstress tax. I've never found it. There's no documentation of this. And the idea that somehow people were just like hush hush about it, like they were not. People just talked about lewd women. They just knew it was happening. This is a picture of the census, one of the censuses. She is listed in the census as a bed housekeeper. Like this whole idea that people had to like hide what they were doing. I have never found any proof of this. This letter is the one time that she actually wrote to the city to get something done through proper channels in 1890. I kind of feel like she just did this to be like, I think she was being a little feisty when she did this. So she talks about how she built this big brick building. It's like it's going to bring all this business in, but the sidewalk is too small. The response from the alderman was just like, nah, girl, we're not giving you a wider sidewalk. Then we'd have to give everyone a wider sidewalk. But this is like one of the only times that she actually went through proper channels for something, which I think is kind of funny and interesting. And then these are some of those like big books that the information comes in. This one down here, I think, is the proof of naturalization. We see her on the like list of people who applied to naturalize. Not that many people did it. Like most people just didn't bother to do it. So there's a couple more pictures I have. Let's see if we have anything else here that I didn't show you. I think that's it. Yeah. Here I will leave you with, again, some of the recommendations that I have. Native Seattle by Cole Thrush is really, really good. It's a little academic, kind of dense, but it is a very thorough history, not just of the impact of colonization on Seattle, but also of the physical impact that white people had when they came to Seattle. They flattened it. If you've read, I don't have Too Tall and Too Steep over here, but that's one about the regrade. They flattened the city. They filled in a bunch of areas. Pioneer Square, where you think about now, like walking on First Avenue, you could not walk on First Avenue the way you do now because there were all these little rivulets and little bodies of water. They filled all that in. So like the amount of just physical change that white people brought to Seattle is kind of unbelievable. Although very believable. So Native Seattle is a really good book on that front. The River That Made Seattle by B.J. Cummings is quite good. Starvation Heights is not about Lou Graham. Uh, it is about a woman who had a health clinic and starved people, but it is like a really, if you're interested in this kind of story, I highly recommend Starvation Heights just because it's one of those like little weird histories that I think is so interesting. And then The Bitter Waters of Medicine Creek is another really good examination of sort of like the indigenous experience upon white people showing up. So those are my books to recommend. But if you ever have questions, if anybody ever has questions for me, if you want to talk more about this, I love talking about this subject, obviously. And I'm more than happy to turn over anything I found. I'm not precious about anything. It's all just stuff in public record. So if you ever want to see anything, you can just reach out to me.
Thank you, Hannah. It is obvious that you enjoy your subject and you have helped us enjoy this history too. I
I love
love all
her.
the questions. It was great to get that kind of response from the audience. So I hope you consider this a, a wonderful experience. It has been for us. Thank you very much. And thank you,
Anytime.
everybody, for participating. Everybody. And so if there's no other questions, somebody did ask what Lou looked like, Hannah.
Great question. We don't know. We don't have an actual photo of her, but in Annie Jordan, okay, in this out of print novel, there is a description of her that I think is probably pretty close. She's described as being short, kind of stout, quite sort of Germanic in her features, and wearing little pince-nez glasses and like a big hat. And all of that I fully believe. But I think she was a little she's kind of a little rotund lady, or just like sort of compact, which perhaps I'm projecting as a person who's 4'11". But that's the only time I've ever really, and that she had like very like dark steely hair. But I'm hoping someday someone will come forward with a photo of her that they have in like a family record somewhere. It's probably in someone's attic.
Very, very interesting history for the Southwest Seattle Historical Society's meeting. Thank you again for the history, in addition to the entertainment and the knowledge that you have shared and all the reading. So good luck to you. We'll be watching for another book.
Yeah, I mean, again, if anybody has anything else you want me to hunt down, let me know because I do love to do this work.
All right, we could probably find you. Thank you very much. And
Thanks,
good
Anna.
night, everybody. Thank you for being here at Words Writers.